There's this little moment in Tears of the Kingdom that legitimately blew me away. It's this one here, where you are tasked with finding a droplet in the sky and shooting an arrow through it. The rubble that litters the sky, when standing at just the right spot, reveals the droplet. Now, really, there's not much to this. It's not really a puzzle where I had to use my brain, nor is it an organic thing that I randomly found in the world. But it still felt like both of those things. It felt like a discovery as well as something very much crafted. To me, it felt quite serendipitous. This reminded me of similar riddles that you can find in movies, but I don't know if it's just me or what, but these never feel quite as exhilarating to figure out, even if you see it before it's supposed to be found by the relevant character. There's an on-rails nature to it, and I think that's what sours things in film. Whereas in a game like Tears of the Kingdom, nothing moves, nothing changes. There are no frames pushing the story forward. Progression is left up to you. Because of that, it makes it feel much more like you discovered it. Which is basically to say that the effectiveness of these visual riddles is amplified by the nature of how video games work on a fundamental level, and so should be in more of them, I reckon. This teardrop one was my favourite, but Tears of the Kingdom has plenty of them all over the place, and though there is a sense of satisfaction in finding them that is given to the players, as a designer, an additional benefit you get is that it imbues the world with a sense of craft, which is a feeling that can be lost when you have worlds and level at the scales we see them today. The weapon breaking system. So, a lot of people hate this mechanic. Hell, I would say that I even hate this mechanic. But begrudgingly, I have to say that it has my goddamn respect. It is just so thematically appropriate that I have to say that. But for as much as everyone talks about how annoying it is to have your flow ruined by having to find another weapon, or even how well it works in terms of forcing you to think on your feet and the idea of always having to scavenge for another weapon, because, Breath of the Wild is about surviving the wilds, there is something rather fundamental that I think everyone misses, and it is that this weapon breaking mechanic or system makes the Master Sword uniquely powerful. Often, games will have some kind of mythical weapon or item that the story will tell you changes everything. And though they will usually look the part, all they do mechanically is have the highest damage or whatever, which is fine, but what is cool about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is that it sets up a rule that all weapons break. Except in the case of the Master Sword. The one-of-a-kind singular weapon breaks that rule. Much like its heightened significance in the story, it stands above the other weapons mechanically by being the sole weapon able to repair itself. Now, as a caveat to this, functionally the Master Sword still breaks, so it is thematically a little weaker in that respect, but having it be unbreakable would make the central theme of surviving the wild a little bit redundant, so even though I personally would have gone the other way, the system as it is a decent compromise. What we can learn from this as game designers is that breaking the rules is okay, and it will often mean something if you do it. So, say you have a weapon or some kind of MacGuffin or whatever in your story that holds a tremendous amount of significance. In a way, these items, by being that important, break the rules. And so mechanically, they should break the rules also. This is a bit harder to do in a game like Borderlands or Overwatch, where the weapons and abilities are already so versatile. But if you have a more rigid and well-defined system, like the weapon breaking of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, then having a weapon that breaks the system can lead to extra meaning, or at least a reinforcement of themes. And even if it doesn't do that, I can almost guarantee that a player finding that weapon will feel like it is special, which is also good. Characterization in an open world. This year, I think we have even more evidence of the idea that characterization beats realism. Back in the day, we had Resident Evil 4, and people pointed out how absurd it was for this merchant guy to just show up all over the place, even though everything was so dangerous, and how he was always just ahead of the player. The lack of realism didn't really matter, because the character of a merchant, by virtue of us coming into contact so often, allowed us to feel a sense of familiarity when we heard his theme or saw him within the game. It didn't make sense for him to be there, but he was a familiar figure that put us at ease in increasingly foreign and hostile environments. This year we had the release of Diablo 4, and though I never played the game, it was interesting to me to hear this specific complaint.
Instead of having one blacksmith who's like an actual character that you can talk to, who also repairs your shit and sells you stuff, we now have 75 soulless, empty blacksmiths scattered across the land of Sanctuary, none of whom play any role in the story or contribute at all to the world building. This doesn't apply to just the blacksmiths in the world of Diablo 4, it applies to all vendors in the game. They serve no purpose outside of gameplay.
Now, realistically, it makes more sense for each shopkeeper to have their own name and portrait and be a different person in each location. But I can't help but think that it would have been easier and more endearing for the developers to have gone the Resident Evil route and just had the one guy in every town, because then one, the player gets an emotional anchor in each foreign area, and two, since it is a character rather than just some randomly generated set of names and items, they can be built up with their own sort of intrigue and or backstory or whatever else to invest the player even further. This is what Tears of the Kingdom does with this guy. There's no real depth to his characterization, but as soon as you spot him randomly out in the world, you know exactly what is going on, and it works as a really good balance for a game about finding stuff. When you're just out there exploring, things can be a bit overwhelming. But then you spot something you've seen a million times, and your mind just sort of settles, and there's this comfort there. I don't know if any one of you out there have been overseas and spent a decent amount of time in a different country, but if you have, let me know in the comments if you've experienced something like this. There's this sort of magical experience you can get walking through a supermarket or just exploring places where you're surrounded by all this foreign stuff that you can't read and these brands that you don't recognize. But then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a familiar piece of packaging will just take all of your attention. And it's because you recognize it from where you live, and it feels like you've discovered something, even though you used to see it every day. Now, a lot of this is due to expectations. I don't think anyone is surprised when they see Coca-Cola out there, but for me, wandering around supermarkets in Vietnam, it was seeing a can of Milo on a shelf that had this effect. Anyway, the point of this segment was that characterization beats realism, and having a character appear in places where they shouldn't be realistically, one, can give the player paradoxically the sense of surprise, but also a sense of ease and familiarity, and two, you get a stronger sense of character and the option to build up that character if you want to for very little work, and realism on the other hand can often feel a bit soulless. Using the UI. The last thing I wanted to point out in Tears of the Kingdom takes place toward the very end of the game. It happens to just be like the tiniest thing, but probably made me the most giddy upon experiencing it. So to set this up, all bosses in Tears of the Kingdom appear like this. They show up, and then the UI makes it clear how significant these guys are above your normal enemies. Every single boss has this health bar that takes up this exact amount of space on the screen. So, for the final battle, and the most significant and singular boss, much like the Master Sword, Ganondorf's health bar breaks the rules. I love just how slow the health bar fills up. It builds a ton of anticipation, and then it reaches the point where you expect it to stop, like every other boss in the game, only to continue and continue. It is just magnificent use of UI to convey the threat of Ganondorf and how much stronger he is compared to the other bosses. Secondly, I love this because it's very similar to an idea that I had for a game, which hopefully I'll end up making someday, but basically the concept was to play on the idea of gaining a score, which is something you would do to compete with people back in the ye olde days of video games. Now, for really skilled players, you would hit some kind of cap, like 9999, or whatever number of bytes you were limited by. But I wanted to have it so, as the score grew, it actually just escaped the bounds of the UI and just kept going and going. The number would keep going up, but it was essentially so big that it broke the bounds of the frame of the camera. So to see a familiar thing in Tears of the Kingdom makes me feel like my crackpot opinions are actually shared by some of the best designers out there, which is really neat. But aside from that, I think the lesson that should be learned here is that UI can be treated as non-static. And what I mean by that is that depending on the circumstances, we should be willing to change how the UI represents things, whether it be enemy health or player score, or maybe even something like the minimap or menu system. Now, if you're confused by that, Imagine playing a barbarian, and when you go into a rage, you are unable to pause because you're enraged. Or maybe, if you don't want to go that far, you can change it so that it's the options when you pause that are limited, so that you can't mess around with, say, your inventory when you're raging as a barbarian, but maybe other characters can. There's like an infinite number of cool things you could do here, especially because messing with UI for artistic reasons is severely underutilized. So that's the takeaway here. And I find it quite remarkable that Nintendo, a AAA mass market company making games for kids, are the ones pushing the medium forward in terms of creativity and artistic experimentation, and yet so many people will turn toward games that would rather be movies and say they are the example of what the medium is capable of. Anyway, those are just some things that I thought were really cool that Tears of the Kingdom did. If you're wondering why I didn't talk about the more obvious things the game does, it's because there is a much, much bigger video in the works that I haven't quite been able to acceptably smush the words together on, but it will be on the way. And to elaborate on that a little bit further, I will also say that that tangent about a holiday wasn't for nothing, because I am going on holiday. A little bit against my will, but, family and whatnot. So if you are keen for a video about analyzing the themes and the sneaky hidden narrative of Tears of the Kingdom, you should subscribe and ring the bell. Do those things even work anymore? Anyway, it'll be a good chunk of time before I get the next one out, so yeah, stay tuned, and thank you very much for watching.